A group of Pleistocene humans is sheltering under a rock overhang on a rainy night. Their fire has been low for a long time. The reserve wood, carefully gathered during the day, is now soaked with dampness. Someone in the group gently digs into the ash, trying to find a coal that still holds a bit of heat. A tiny red dot faintly appears when blown on. A thin wisp of smoke rises into the air, but absolutely no flame catches. That red dot fades, and then dies completely. The sounds in the space suddenly change. The familiar crackle of dry wood vanishes. The faces around the hearth sink into the dark, no longer visible to one. The sound of the falling rain and the rustling in the darkness outside suddenly feel louder, clearer, and much closer than before. What just disappeared along with that red dot? A source of heat for warming up? A stove for cooking? Or the entire center of the camp? To know exactly how serious this incident is, we cannot just look at the cold ash. We have to ask a question that archaeology can rarely answer. Did they only know how to keep a fire going, or did they actually know how to make one? When we ask what happens when the fire goes out, that is only scratching the surface. The deeper, decisive question is, does the group have fire-making tools? Do they have dry tinder? Does anyone in the group know how to use those tools? And exactly what survival activities are they depending on that fire for? We can break this event down into 3 different levels of crisis. The first level is a relight problem, meaning they have the technique and the tools, but the weather or materials are working against them. The second level is a knowledge problem, where the tools are still there, but only a few specific people in the group know how to use them. The third, and most dangerous, is an access problem. The group is completely unable to start a fire themselves and is forced to find another source of fire from the outside. And that is exactly why the phrase early humans accidentally becomes a trap. It lumps hundreds of thousands of years of vastly different technological levels into one single dark night. We often have a very simple vision of the past. Someone accidentally smashes 2 rocks together, creates fire, and from that moment on, all of humanity could flick on a lighter whenever they want. But reality is far more complex. Using fire, maintaining a flame, and making a fire are 3 completely different abilities. Using fire means you know how to put food into the heat, warm yourself, use the light to work, or use the flame to sharpen a wooden stone. Maintaining fire is a totally different skill set. You have to know which fuel burns the longest, how to control the size of the flame, how to shield it from wind and rain, how to bank embers overnight, and how to carry fire from one location. Meanwhile, creating a flame is an entirely separate technological leap. It requires you to turn friction or a spark into a burning coal, transfer that coal into a bundle of tinder, and patiently nurse that tinder into a stable flame in real-world wilderness conditions. Archaeology can easily find ash and heat-fractured rocks, but it is incredibly difficult to tell if that fire was taken from a natural wildfire or sparked right on the spot. Wooden tools used to create friction fires have an extremely low chance of surviving over hundreds of thousands of years. Therefore, losing fire does not just have one definition. The flame might have died, but the coals are still hot enough to blow into a fire. The coals might be cold, but they are holding a fire-making kit. Or they have the tools, but the tinder and fuel are completely soaked. Even worse, the materials are there, but the only person who possesses the fire-making skill is not. And finally, it could be a group that has absolutely no reliable technology to make fire. The history of fire is not a straight line. It was likely a prolonged process, starting with humans accessing natural wildfires, learning to feed them, and then learning to transport them. The development of fire-making techniques, passing them down, and standardizing them happened much later. The current evidence shows that traces of fire use appear very early, while widespread signals of use and direct evidence of fire-making appear significantly later. But we also have to break another assumption. Having no fire does not mean it is impossible to survive. Certain prehistoric groups lived in relatively northern latitudes long before the archaeological record shows fire being used as a regular technology. They might have relied on shelters, clothing, body metabolism, shifting their activities to the daytime, or seasonal migration. The exact contribution of each solution remains a mystery, but clearly, fire was not their only. Whether that group has the ability to relight the flame or not, the exact moment the fire dies, several countdown clocks start ticking all at once. The first clock is light. The immediate consequence they feel is the space around them suddenly shrinks. The hands and faces of the people sitting next to them become hard to see. Small tools can easily get lost in the dark. Caring for children, treating a wound, or prepping materials for the next day becomes twice as difficult. People in the group can no longer read each other's facial expressions or gestures, and the shadowy movements outside the shelter become incredibly hard to identify. Fire never lit up the whole landscape anyway, and because its light is so localized, losing it means the familiar, safe part of the camp vanishes long before any real danger actually. The second clock is heat. In cold climates, or when their bodies, clothing, and shelter are wet, the group must react immediately. They have to close the distance between members, huddling tightly together to share body heat. Children, the injured, or those at risk of hypothermia are prioritized and wrapped in the center. Any tasks that require standing still outside the shelter have to stop. They might even desperately burn less than ideal materials, creating loads of toxic smoke or wasting precious fuel. Of course, fire is just one layer of their thermal system. They don't instantly transition from fire goes out to freezing to death, but they just lost their most important temperature regulator. The third clock is food. The very next meal has to be instantly recategorized. What foods can be eaten raw? What needs to be pounded, mashed, or chopped up more to be digestible? What foods are usually cooked, but can be delayed for a few days? What meat is at risk of spoiling quickly if it is not smoked or roasted? And finally, what foods only provide high nutritional value after being softened or heated? Modern experiments show that cooking allows the body to extract significantly more energy from meat and starchy tubers. While we cannot calculate the exact calorie deficit for an ancient human, the group clearly did not lose all their food. They just lost the right to use that food in the most familiar and highly efficient way. The fourth clock is nighttime safety. Without a fire, the visual signals warning other animals that this is an active camp drop significantly. People waking up in the middle of the night have a much harder time monitoring the immediate area. The warning signal of shifting, flickering light is gone, and people tend to end their day earlier and fall asleep faster. While archaeological evidence of fire directly stopping a predator attack is quite limited, losing the fire undoubtedly makes the camp harder to monitor and slower to react. The fifth clock is the social schedule. The flame divided the human day into distinct parts: time for moving and foraging, time for processing food, the window of activity after sunset, and time for tool maintenance and information. Observations of communities like the Jew Hoansi show that nighttime firelight conversations are distinctly different from daytime talk. The night is when they tell stories, pass down knowledge, and strengthen social bonds. While this is not a perfect window directly into the Paleolithic, it shows that fire created an extra social shift. When the fire goes out, that shared space shrinks. And the final clock, which is the deciding one, the choice of recovery. The group has to make a tough call. Do they try digging for a last ember under the ash? Do they risk the dark to find dry tinder and fuel? Do they break out the fire-making kit, if they have one? Or do they send someone out to find a natural fire, or trek to another group to ask for a light? Would they even have to move the entire camp in the middle of the night? Or do they simply accept living without fire temporarily until the next morning? This decision depends on countless factors: the current weather, the condition of the injured, the presence of young children, the food they have on hand, the distance to resources, and most importantly, how certain they are that they can actually restore the flame. This chain of consequences makes perfect sense mechanically. But what archaeological puzzle pieces actually show that humans were so dependent on fire that a dead hearth could trigger a survival crisis? Let's start at Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. The Acheulean cultural layer here dates back roughly 1 million years. Microstratigraphy and spectroscopy analysis found well-preserved plant ash in the sediment, along with fragments of burnt bone. More importantly, this burnt material is located deep inside the cave context, which points much more strongly to fires being burned on-site rather than ash being carried in by wind or water. This is some of the strongest evidence that very early hominins incorporated fire into their living space. The current archaeology confirms the use of fire, but the record at this site does not tell us how they started it. Did they make it themselves, keep it alive from another source they carried in, or just harvest it from a random wildfire? If the group at Wonderwerk relied entirely on preserving embers, a cold hearth means something fundamentally different than us forgetting to turn on the stove today. We cannot conclude that the people at Wonderwerk didn't know how to make fire, but clearly evidence of use always appears long before evidence of fire-making technology. Moving forward to about 780,000 years ago, at the ancient lakeside site of Gesher Benot Ya'aqov in Israel, we see a different level of dependence. Researchers discovered that the people here heavily targeted two species of large carp. They found massive numbers of pharyngeal teeth, but very few actual fish bones. These teeth show signs of heat exposure and are clustered around phantom hearths concentrations of burnt flint micro-artifacts, indicating where fires used to be, even though the hearth structures are no longer intact. This result strongly supports the hypothesis that the fish were cooked before being eaten. Fire here wasn't just an evening comfort. It was deeply integrated into the chain of acquiring and processing food. At this site, at least, the menu was organized around heat. If the fire goes out, the freshly caught fish do not suddenly become useless, but their most familiar and efficient processing method is entirely disrupted. They would have to eat differently, preserve the food differently, or prioritize getting the fire back above everything else. But around 400,000 years ago, at Barnham, in Suffolk, England, things start to change. A study published in the journal Nature in 2025 described a preserved land surface with baked sediment, flint hand axes that were cracked by heat, and notably, 2 pieces of iron pyrite. Pyrite is a very rare mineral in the local geology, suggesting it was intentionally brought to the site. The combination of flint and pyrite creates a toolkit capable of generating sparks. This is the earliest published direct evidence for intentional firemaking. With a group possessing the technique found at Barnham, the concept of losing fire completely changes its nature. They no longer necessarily had to wait for a lightning strike or a natural wildfire. But knowing how to strike a spark does not mean having fire on demand. They still needed pyrite, the right kind of striking rock, bone-dry tinder, and serious skill. Striking a new spark is just the first step. That spark has to be carefully coaxed into a coal, and from that coal, blown into a stable flame. And even when fire-making technology appeared, it wasn't automatically handed out to every individual on Earth. A cross-cultural study synthesized ethnographic records of 93 hunter-gatherer communities, looking at how they made, used, and preserved fire. The results showed that 88 groups knew a traditional fire-making method, but 5 groups were described in the sources as lacking any such method. Even in some communities that had the technology, the knowledge was centralized among very few individuals. Out of 35 groups with records on how often they made new fires, the vast majority rarely did it. Instead, keeping and transporting fire between camps was extremely common. This comparative data shows that fire-making skills could be unevenly distributed and should not be taken for granted. It breaks 2 major assumptions. First, that everyone in a group possessed equal skills, and second, that just because you can make fire, you don't need to bother preserving embers. Making fire in the wilderness can take a lot of time, depends heavily on materials, easily fails in wet conditions, and requires constantly practiced technique. Banking coals and carrying them is often much cheaper and safer than starting from scratch. Therefore, if the fire dies out exactly when the only person with the skill is out hunting, is injured, or didn't bring their kit, a technical glitch instantly becomes a social crisis. Beyond heat and food, the flame also holds a massive portion of the day's time. Polly Weisner's research comparing daytime conversations with the nighttime firelight activity of the Jew, Hoansey highlighted profound differences. Daytime talk leans heavily toward work, resources, tense relationships, and practical. But by the fire at night, the time is dedicated to storytelling, singing, rituals, discussing distant people, and passing down broad social norms. Losing fire can shrink that shared time after sunset. It doesn't just take away a glowing object. It ends the day early, reduces the ability to repair tools in the evening, narrows the shared space, and forces the group to separate and go to sleep sooner. This is a slower and less obvious consequence than cold or hunger, but it directly affects how a group transmits experience and bonds with one another. These 5 pieces of evidence do not recreate one specific fireless night in the but they provide all the ingredients of a crisis, a technology that could be used long before humans knew how to make it on demand, a menu that was already designed around heat, a survival skill that might only be in the hands of a few, and a crucial part of social life that only existed when the night still had. So, how does this alter power, movement, and social? For a group that knows how to make fire, their biggest enemy is environmental conditions. Having flint and pyrite in hand is still not enough. The tinder must be dry enough to catch the spark. Materials must be carefully prepped. The wind cannot blow too hard and snuff out the fragile light. The person doing it must keep their hands completely steady, and the whole group must have gathered fuel ranging from tiny twigs to larger logs to feed the flame. A prolonged rainstorm can turn a highly reliable technique into a cascading chain of failures. But for groups that rely mainly on keeping fire, their biggest enemy is distance. When the last coal has gone completely cold, their choices become vastly more brutal. They might have to search for a new natural wildfire, backtrack to an old camp hoping an ember survived, or accept living in the dark and cold until a new opportunity arrives. When you cannot create fire yourself, the map of fire sources suddenly becomes more important than the map of food. This scarcity can create webs of dependence between groups. Another band that possesses fire can become an invaluable source of help, a trading partner, or a place where they have to carefully negotiate acts. We do not have evidence to construct bloody prehistoric wars fought entirely over fire, but accessing a fire source managed by someone else undoubtedly carries incredibly complex social dimensions. There is a terrifying paradox that technology can be lost long before the physical items representing it. As the cross-cultural survey suggested, if the skill is centralized among a few people, an unexpected death, an accident, or the splitting of a group can make an advanced technique completely alien. The flint is still there, the pyrite is still there, the dry tinder is in the pouch, but the sequence of actions to connect them is permanently gone. A lost fire sometimes forces a group to make a painful decision, abandoning a safe shelter. If they choose to stay, they face the cold, cannot process their most important food, and must restrict all nighttime activity. But if they move, they have to leave the rock roof, shielding them from the rain, carry the elderly and young, burn precious energy, and enter untested terrain in the pitch dark. Sometimes the most dangerous consequence of losing the fire isn't inside the camp. It's on the path the group is forced to take to get it back. Of course, we also have to accept a less dramatic reality. Sometimes there is no disaster at all. On a warm night, with a dry shelter and a food source that can be consumed without cooking, the group simply goes to sleep earlier than usual. They might leisurely wait for materials to dry and relight the fire the next morning, or just continue their journey. Dependence on fire is a continuous spectrum, not an absolute life or death switch. All of this makes for an incredibly compelling survival story. But archaeological evidence always sets strict limits, reminding us that often we don't even know if the fire truly went out or if simply the traces of it no longer exist for us to find. Not finding ash does not mean there was no fire. Ash can be blown away by the wind, dissolved by rainwater, trampled and scattered, or completely chemically altered over hundreds of thousands of years. The phantom hearths at Gesher Benot Ya'aqov, identified by clusters of burnt flint rather than an intact hearth structure, perfectly illustrate how traces of fire can survive in an incomplete state. Conversely, finding burnt traces does not automatically mean humans made that fire. A natural wildfire, materials burned elsewhere and washed in, or redeposited sediments are all explanations that must be carefully ruled out. That is why the evidence at Wonderwerk has to rely on complex microstratigraphy, and Barnham relies on a combination of indicators rather than just a single burnt piece of stone. Ethnographic data from 93 modern communities is also just a comparison, not a time. It shows us that fire-making capabilities can vary. Preserving fire can be highly prioritized, and skills can be centralized. But it does not allow us to definitively claim that a group of Homo erectus a million years ago carried embers using the exact same method as a community documented in the 19th century. The energetic benefits of cooking also do not tell us exactly how dependent each group was. A group could have easily switched between raw food, pounded food, dried food, or naturally fermented food depending on their environment. Similarly, the archaeological record in Europe shows that hominins may have appeared in freezing northern regions before fire became widespread. Therefore, the fire going out does not mean their entire ability to thermoregulate was instantly wiped out. The truth is, there are things we cannot directly know. We do not know how often Paleolithic people let the fire. We don't know the average time it took them to recover a flame. We don't know who got blamed, what rituals they had surrounding firekeeping, or how many deaths were actually directly tied to a lost fire incident. This video reconstructs a logical chain of consequences based on evidence of fire use and technology. It does not recreate a specific incident recorded by archaeology. Precisely because we cannot witness that night with our own eyes, the value of the story isn't in guessing their every action, but in realizing how much of life was quietly anchored to one tiny glowing spot. For humans today, creating fire is so easy that the act has become almost invisible. We turn a gas stove, strike a match, press a lighter, or use electricity. No one invented fire and handed out an instruction manual to the rest of humanity. That ultimate convenience makes us forget that a flame always requires an energy source, an ignition mechanism, combustible material, the knowledge to use them, and the right environmental conditions. A widespread modern power outage is a perfect parallel. It is not as life-threatening as the cold of an ice age, but the mechanism of collapse is identical. When an infrastructure system vanishes, multiple services stop simultaneously. Light, communication, food preservation, heating or cooling systems, and how we organize our work. Risks steadily compound over time, and those with backup plans are the ones who recover the fastest. The lesson here is not that modern humans are weaker than our ancestors. The lesson is, the more services a technology provides, the more severe the chain reaction is when it's lost. The resilience of any system comes from layers of redundancy and the distribution of knowledge. For ancient fire users, that redundancy might have been banking multiple coals in different spots, fiercely protecting dry tinder materials, always carrying a fire kit, ensuring multiple group members knew the striking technique, and maintaining good relationships with neighboring. So, when we return to the dead ember at the beginning of the story, the answer to their future depends entirely on what remains after the red glow fades. The materials, the knowledge, and the people capable of putting those elements back under the rock overhang in the rain. The last coal has truly gone cold. There is no absolute panic. Instead, the people in the camp start checking what they have left. Is the tinder material still dry? Are the flint and pyrite kits still there? Is the person who knows how to use them awake? Which meals can be delayed, and do they need to relocate immediately? When early humans lost the fire, there wasn't a single outcome. For a group possessing dry materials and expert fire-making skills, it might just be a few frustrating hours. But for a group that relied primarily on preserving the flame, this incident could simultaneously sever their heat source, halt their cooking, strip away their light, and erase their nighttime activity. It could force them to completely overhaul their menu, shrink their range of activity, or brave the dark to find a new source of fire. The danger didn't just lie within the fire itself, but in the gap between the group's needs and their ability to call the flame back. Under the rock, One person starts striking the pyrite hard against the flint. Another cups their hands tightly around a bundle of dry tinder. A third uses their body to block the cold gusts of wind. The rest gather tiny twigs, ready to feed them in the exact right order. The first spark flashes, lands on the tinder, and dies out. The second spark catches on the dry material. A tiny speck of light appears, breathing faintly between the hands, carefully shielding it. Using fire was a benefit. Recovering it was resilience. When the fire went out, what determined the future of the entire group wasn't the final ember. It was whether the knowledge to create the next one was still shared.